Two exiled alien girls sent to Earth as punishment found meaning through one gentle human. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Let's return to the main character. Ethan Walker first noticed the silence before he noticed anything else, the kind of quiet that settles in after a storm has already passed, when the air feels rinsed and the world seems to be holding its breath. The sensors on his climate console blinked steady green, humidity at 40%, temperature locked at a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit inside the small maintenance station. Outside, the sky over the outskirts of the city glowed a dull steel gray, clouds stacked like tired shoulders. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out onto the gravel path, boots crunching softly, his jacket thin but familiar against his arms. He wasn't looking for company. He rarely was. That was when he saw them. Two figures stood near the old service road, motionless, as if they had been placed there and forgotten. They were taller than most women he knew, slender in a way that suggested careful design rather than hunger, their skin a muted green that caught the flat daylight without reflecting it. Long green hair hung damp around their shoulders, darker at the ends, and when one of them lifted her head, Ethan caught a flash of color that didn't belong to Earth at all, eyes a vivid, unmistakable violet. The taller one held herself rigid, chin high, posture proud despite the mud on her boots and the tremor running through her arms. The other leaned slightly to the side, breathing shallow, her focus drifting like she was counting clouds that weren't there. Ethan didn't reach for his phone. He didn't ask who they were or where they'd come from. He just felt the cold in the air, imagined it settling into bones that weren't made for this planet, and shrugged out of his jacket. The gravel shifted as he approached, slow and visible, hands open. The taller one stepped forward immediately, placing herself between him and the other, her expression sharp, defensive. She said something in a language that sounded precise and controlled, even strained, and though Ethan didn't understand the words, he understood the meaning. Don't come closer. He stopped a few feet away and held the jacket out anyway, letting it hang there like an offering he wouldn't force. It's cold, he said, voice low, even. You can have this. The one behind her swayed, just a little, enough that Ethan noticed, enough that the taller one noticed too. Violet eyes flicked back, then forward again, anger tightening her jaw. She shook her head once, firm, almost offended. Ethan didn't argue. He set the jacket down on a dry patch of ground between them and took a step back. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and wet concrete, and the quieter one finally looked at him fully, her gaze lingering on his hands, his face, the space he was giving them. There was fear there, yes, but also something else, something searching. Ethan turned toward the station and keyed the door open, warm air spilling out in a soft rush. There's heat inside, he said over his shoulder. You can warm up if you want. I'll be right here. He stepped aside and waited, listening to the hum of machinery and the distant city, trusting that sometimes the gentlest thing a person can do is make room and let others decide what to do with it. Ethan stayed by the door long enough to hear movement behind him, the faint scuff of unfamiliar boots on concrete, then the soft hiss as the heat vents adjusted to the new load in the room. He did not turn right away. He focused on the steady rhythm of the filtration unit, the quiet click of relays cycling power, giving them time to decide without feeling watched. When he finally glanced back, the quieter one was seated on the bench near the wall, shoulders slumped, hands wrapped around a cup of warm water he had left there earlier. The taller one remained standing, eyes scanning the room with careful precision, taking inventory of every tool rack, every exit, every humming panel. She did not thank him. She did not need to. Ethan returned to his workbench and pretended to tighten a bolt that did not need tightening, letting the minutes stretch. The smell of warm metal mixed with rain-soaked fabric filled the station. Outside, the sky darkened toward evening, the temperature dropping another few degrees as the weather shifted. The quieter one exhaled slowly, color returning to her face in subtle shades Ethan could not name, and for the first time she spoke in careful English, each word placed like a fragile object. She said her name was Naelith. The taller one stiffened at that, turning sharply, violet eyes flashing, but Naelith met her gaze and gently shook her head. After a moment, the taller one relented with visible effort and said her name was Lyra, her tone clipped, formal, as if stating a rank rather than an identity. Ethan nodded once, respectful, and gave his own name without offering anything else. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, like a room learning new acoustics. Lyra finally asked why he had not called anyone, her voice edged with suspicion. Ethan shrugged, the motion small. He said he worked nights and did not see many people, and that sometimes help did not need an audience. Lyra scoffed softly, turning away, but Ethan noticed the way her shoulders eased a fraction. Naelith's gaze drifted around the room, lingering on a faded photograph taped near the console, a younger Ethan standing beside an old air scrubber unit, both of them covered in dust and smiling anyway. She asked if he lived there. Ethan said not exactly, but close enough that the station felt like home. He moved to adjust the thermostat, lowering it slightly, watching Naelith relax as the heat stabilized. Lyra watched his hands closely, the way he checked readouts twice, careful not to waste energy. She asked if he expected something in return. Ethan shook his head, surprised by the question, and said no one had ever needed to earn warmth before. That answer unsettled her more than anger would have. Naelith set the empty cup down and closed her eyes, just for a second, as if committing the feeling to memory. Outside, headlights passed on the distant road, then faded, leaving the station wrapped in its own small bubble of light. Lyra moved closer to the bench at last, standing guard but no longer blocking the space between Naelith and Ethan. She asked how long they could stay. Ethan considered the question, listening to the building breathe around them, and said they could stay until the rain stopped, or longer if they needed, because the system could handle it and so could he. For the first time since arriving on Earth, neither Lyra nor Naelith felt like they were being measured for usefulness. They were simply there, existing in borrowed warmth, while one gentle human pretended the world had always been meant to hold them. Ethan slept lightly that night on the narrow cot in the back room, the steady hum of the station wrapping around him like a familiar blanket. When he woke, it was still dark, the digital clock glowing 5:42 a.m., rain tapping softly against the metal siding. For a moment, he listened for sounds that would tell him he had imagined everything, but there it was, the quiet murmur of two unfamiliar voices, low and careful, speaking in a cadence that rose and fell like breath. He sat up slowly and stepped back into the main room. Lyra stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the rain as if daring it to do worse. Naelith sat at the small fold-out table, examining a simple Earth map Ethan had left out, her finger tracing coastlines with quiet wonder. They both looked up when he entered. Lyra's posture tightened by habit, but she did not move away. Naelith offered a small nod, her expression softer than before. Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee, then hesitated and poured a second cup of warm water instead, sliding it across the table without comment. Naelith accepted it with both hands, a faint smile flickering and then fading, like she was not used to letting it stay. Lyra asked how long until the station opened to the public. Ethan told her it would be hours yet, most people avoiding the rain and the early cold. She nodded, processing, calculating. Ethan asked if they had eaten. Lyra started to refuse out of reflex, but Naelith answered honestly, saying they had not since before they arrived. Ethan opened a cabinet and set out simple food, packaged oatmeal, fruit cups, nothing fancy, nothing that asked for gratitude. He turned his back again, giving them privacy. The sound of spoons against plastic was quiet but steady. When Lyra finally spoke, her voice was lower, less sharp, she asked what he expected them to do now. Ethan considered that. While he rinsed his mug. He said he expected nothing, but that Earth was large and complicated, and sometimes people needed time to learn how to stand on it without being pushed. That answer did not satisfy Lyra, but it stayed with her. Nalith asked why he chose to work alone, in a place most people forgot existed. Ethan shrugged and said machines were honest, they broke when they were stressed and worked when they were cared for, and that made sense to him. Lyra studied him with new intensity, like she was looking for the lie hidden in the sentence and not finding one. As morning crept in, the rain eased into mist, light filtering through the clouds in pale bands. Ethan stepped outside to check the external units, the damp air cool on his face. When he returned, Lyra was kneeling beside the open panel he had left unattended, watching Nalith carefully adjust a dial, her movements precise despite unfamiliar technology. Ethan paused, surprised, then simply watched. Nalith glanced up, embarrassed, and said the system logic was different but not wrong, just tuned for a species that forgot how fragile air could be. Ethan nodded, intrigued, and asked what she would change. Nalith explained quietly, not with authority, but with care, suggesting small efficiencies, ways to reduce waste without sacrificing comfort. Ethan listened, truly listened, and implemented her ideas without questioning her right to speak. Lyra saw that, saw the way he trusted competence without demanding proof of worth, and something in her expression cracked, just a little. Later, as the clouds thinned and the world outside began to move again, Lyra admitted in a flat voice that Earth was meant to be their sentence, a place where they would be small and powerless. Ethan tightened a bolt and said sometimes sentences turned into chances, depending on who showed up. Lyra did not respond, but when she turned back toward the door, her stance was no longer that of someone waiting to be cast out. It was the stance of someone deciding whether to stay. Ethan spent the next few days adjusting to the quiet addition of two lives moving alongside his own, not intruding, not demanding, simply existing within the small orbit of the maintenance station. Lyra kept her distance at first, positioning herself near windows and doors, always aware of exits, always listening, while Nalith gravitated toward the machines, drawn by their steady logic and honest feedback. Ethan did not assign tasks or set rules. He only showed them where the tools were stored, where the spare blankets lived, where the kettle shut itself off when it reached the right temperature. The station settled into a new rhythm, one defined by shared mornings and unspoken routines. Nalith began to wake early, sitting with Ethan as he ran diagnostics, asking careful questions about air density thresholds and power load tolerances, her curiosity precise and restrained, as if she was afraid enthusiasm might cost her something. Ethan answered when he could and admitted when he did not know, which surprised her more than expertise ever could. Lyra watched these exchanges from a distance, arms crossed, suspicion slowly giving way to confusion. She had expected conditions, evaluations, some ledger of worth she would eventually fail to balance. Instead, she saw Ethan listen to Nalith as if her insights mattered simply because they were true. One afternoon, as sunlight finally broke through the clouds and warmed the gravel outside, a service truck passed too close to the station, its exhaust rattling an already aging vent. The alarm chimed softly, not urgent but insistent. Ethan moved toward the panel automatically, but Nalith was already there, hands steady, reading the pressure fluctuation and making an adjustment before it escalated. The alarm fell silent. Ethan smiled, genuine and unguarded, and thanked her like she had done him a favor rather than fulfilled a role. Lyra felt something twist in her chest at that, a reaction she did not have language for. Later, as they shared a simple meal, Lyra finally asked what would happen when someone noticed them, when authorities or observers decided they were not meant to be here. Ethan considered the question, chewing slowly, and said that people noticed all kinds of things every day and still chose what mattered. He said he could not promise safety, but he could promise honesty, and that if it came time to make a choice, he would tell them before it was made for them. Lyra absorbed that in silence. That night, she stood outside alone, the stars unfamiliar but bright, and admitted quietly that exile was designed to erase purpose, to strip identity down until nothing remained but survival. Ethan stood beside her, hands in his pockets, and said purpose was not something that could be taken away unless you let someone else define it for you. He did not tell her what hers should be. He did not ask her to stay. He simply let the idea exist between them. Over the following days, Neilith began refining the station systems with Ethan's permission, making small improvements that reduced energy waste and stabilized airflow, changes so subtle they felt like kindness rather than control. Ethan documented the updates under her name without making a show of it. When Lyra noticed, she confronted him, demanding to know why he credited her when no one else would see it. Ethan answered simply that records mattered, even if only to the people who made them. That night, Lyra slept for the first time without positioning herself between Neilith and the door. As dawn crept in, the station humming softly around them, Lyra realized that punishment was supposed to teach obedience, not meaning, and yet here, in a forgotten place with one gentle human, meaning was beginning to take shape anyway. By the end of the first week, the station no longer felt like a place Lyra and Neilith were hiding inside but a place that adjusted itself around them, quietly, without protest. The systems ran smoother, the power usage dropped just enough to notice, and the air carried a steadier warmth that did not fluctuate with the weather outside. Ethan noticed these things the way he noticed everything, without ceremony, but with appreciation. He left the logs open on the console, trusting Neilith to add her notes when she saw something worth recording. She did, carefully, her handwriting precise even in digital form, each change explained, justified, never exaggerated. Lyra watched this process with growing unease. On her world, records were weapons, used to elevate or erase, never neutral. Here, they simply existed. One afternoon, as Ethan restocked filters from the supply shed, a neighbor stopped by, an older man in a county utility jacket who waved from a distance before approaching. Ethan greeted him easily, exchanging a few words about the weather and an upcoming inspection. Lyra stiffened immediately, positioning herself between Neilith and the interior door, her instincts flaring. Ethan noticed and shifted subtly, placing himself where he could be seen, shoulders relaxed, body language open. He introduced Lyra and Neilith only as friends helping him with a backlog of work. The man nodded, uninterested beyond polite curiosity, and left after a few minutes. When the sound of the truck faded, Lyra exhaled sharply, anger flashing through her eyes. She demanded to know why Ethan would expose them so casually, why he would lie so easily. Ethan considered that, leaning against the workbench, and said he did not think of it as lying so much as choosing which truths mattered in which moments. He said no one had asked them to justify their presence, so he saw no reason to offer explanations in advance. Neilith listened closely, absorbing every word, while Lyra turned away, unsettled by the absence of fear in his voice. That evening, Neilith asked Ethan what he would do if they left. The question caught him off guard. He said he would keep the station running, because that was his job, and because places like this mattered even when no one noticed them. Neilith nodded, thoughtful, and said places could matter because of who passed through them, not just who stayed. Ethan smiled at that, a little sadly, and said he liked that way of thinking. As the days continued, Neilith began to venture farther outside, mapping airflow patterns against the terrain, noting how the surrounding structures affected pressure and temperature. Ethan walked with her when he could, answering questions about Earth customs and pointing out constellations by their human names. Lyra followed at a distance, arms crossed, always alert, but listening more than she admitted. One night, as they stood beneath a clear sky, Lyra finally spoke of her exile, not in detail, but enough to reveal the shape of it. She said punishment was meant to teach submission, not reflection, and that those sent away were expected to fade quietly. Ethan listened without interruption. When she finished, he said that fading was not the same as failing, and that sometimes being removed from a system was the only way to see how broken it was. Lyra laughed once, bitter and sharp, but there was no mockery in it, only relief at being heard without judgment. Later, as the station lights dimmed and the world outside fell silent, Lyra sat alone at the console, rereading Neilith's entries, seeing her own name appear occasionally, not as a liability, but as a presence. She realized then that meaning was not something given or earned, but something built quietly, through choices no one forced you to make. In that small, forgotten station, under a sky that did not belong to them, Lyra began to understand that exile had brought her not to an ending, but to a beginning she had never been allowed to imagine. The shift in the air was subtle at first, something Ethan felt more than measured, like a pressure change before a storm that never quite arrived. The station continued its steady rhythm, but beyond its walls the world seemed to be paying attention. A routine systems check flagged an incoming remote diagnostic request from the regional network, nothing unusual on its face, but enough to tighten Ethan's jaw as he read the timestamp. Inspections meant questions, and questions meant eyes. He did not hide the notice. He left it open on the console where Lyra and Nalith could see it. Nalith noticed immediately, her posture straightening as she read through the parameters. She said the request was standard, automated, unlikely to flag anything anomalous if the station continued to operate within expected ranges. Lyra was less convinced. She paced the perimeter, every instinct warning her that systems never watched without intent. Ethan listened to both perspectives without interrupting. When they finished, he said the inspection would happen whether they worried or not, and that preparation did not require fear, only clarity. They spent the afternoon reviewing logs together, Nalith explaining her adjustments in calm, methodical terms, Ethan validating each change against baseline expectations, Lyra standing close enough to hear every word. Nothing was hidden. Nothing needed to be. As evening settled in, the diagnostic pinged and passed without incident, a quiet confirmation that the world had looked and moved on. Lyra exhaled slowly, tension bleeding out of her shoulders, replaced by something unfamiliar and fragile. She admitted she had expected Ethan to tell them to leave before the inspection, to protect himself by sacrificing their presence. Ethan looked at her, surprised, and said protection did not mean isolation, and that he did not believe safety should be purchased with abandonment. That night, Lyra asked a question she had avoided until now. She asked what Earth did to people who did not belong anywhere. Ethan thought about that as he shut down non-essential systems and dimmed the lights. He said Earth did not always know what to do with people like that, but that sometimes it let them choose. For themselves, which was not the same thing as permission, but close enough to matter. Nalith listened, eyes reflecting the soft glow of the panels, and said choice was rare where they came from, often mistaken for weakness. Ethan smiled faintly and said humans made that mistake often too, until they learned otherwise. The following morning, Lyra surprised both of them by asking Ethan to teach her how the station functioned, not from a tactical standpoint, but from the ground up, why certain redundancies existed, why some inefficiencies were tolerated. Ethan agreed without hesitation. As he explained, Lyra asked sharp questions, challenging assumptions, testing boundaries, but no longer looking for traps. She was learning, not to control, but to understand. Nalith watched them, a quiet pride settling in her expression. As days passed, Lyra's presence shifted. She no longer stood guard out of obligation, but out of care, correcting minor faults before they escalated, anticipating needs without being asked. Ethan noticed but did not comment. He understood that naming a change too soon could scare it away. One evening, as they shared a simple dinner, Lyra said she no longer felt like she was waiting for something to end. The statement surprised her as much as it surprised them. Ethan nodded and said sometimes the hardest part of exile was realizing when it was over, even if no one announced it. The station hummed softly around them, a small, steady witness to the quiet truth that had settled in. They had not been given meaning. They had built it, together, piece by piece, in a place that asked nothing of them but honesty. The message arrived just after sunrise, not loud or dramatic, but precise in the way systems spoke when they expected compliance. Ethan read it twice, then once more, feeling the weight settle rather than strike. An external liaison request, joint human and off-world oversight, phrased politely, scheduled narrowly, with coordinates that matched the station too closely to be coincidence. He did not delete it. He did not minimize it. He left it open and went to make coffee, letting the familiar routine steady his breathing. Lyra noticed first, as she always did when something shifted beneath the surface. She read the message silently, jaw tightening, eyes sharpening, the old instincts rising without invitation. Nalith stepped closer, reading over her shoulder, absorbing the language with a scientist's calm. Noting what was said and what was not. She said the wording implied evaluation, not removal, but Lyra heard the unspoken threat anyway. Ethan returned with 3 cups, setting them down carefully, then met their eyes. He said someone was coming to ask questions, and that he would not pretend otherwise. Lyra demanded to know what he planned to do. Ethan answered honestly that he planned to tell the truth, which was that the station was running better than it had in years, and that the help he had received was the reason why. Lyra stared at him, disbelief flickering across her face, and asked if he understood what that could cost him. Ethan nodded and said he understood what it would cost him not to. The hours before the visit stretched thin. Lyra paced, every movement controlled, the weight of old commands pressing against her spine. Nalith reviewed logs, double-checking entries, ensuring every improvement was documented with clarity and restraint. Ethan did what he always did, inspecting filters, checking seals, keeping the station steady. When the transport finally arrived, it did so quietly, settling on the gravel with minimal disturbance, as if respecting the space. 2 representatives stepped out, one human, one alien, both professional, both observant. Ethan greeted them calmly, answering questions without embellishment. Nalith spoke when addressed, her explanations clear, measured, rooted in data and care rather than defense. Lyra stood back at first, silent, watchful, until the alien representative glanced at her and asked her role. For a heartbeat, Lyra felt the old answer rise, the title she had lost, the rank that had been stripped away. Instead, she said she was responsible for ensuring the work was protected, and that she had chosen to stay. The word chosen landed heavier than any credential. The representatives exchanged a look, not hostile, but thoughtful. They walked the station, reviewed outputs, noted efficiency gains and stability improvements that exceeded expectations. When they left, they did so without issuing directives, only acknowledgments, and a statement that the station's performance would be cited as a model. The transport lifted away, leaving the air still. Lyra stood frozen for a moment, then released a breath she had been holding for years. She asked Ethan why he had risked standing with them instead of stepping aside. Ethan considered that and said he had not stood with them, he had simply stayed where he was. That night, Lyra sat alone beneath the stars, the message echoing quietly in her thoughts. Exile had taught her how to endure. Earth, through one gentle human, had taught her how to choose. And in that choice, she felt something she had not felt since before the sentence was passed, not safety, not certainty, but dignity, returned without demand. The station felt different after the visit, not louder or busier, but anchored, like something fragile had decided to stay. Ethan noticed it in the way systems held steady without correction and in the way Lyra no longer scanned the horizon every few minutes. Nalith continued her work with the quiet focus that had become second nature, but there was a new ease in her movements, a confidence that did not brace for punishment. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the clouds in pale gold, Nalith asked Ethan a question she had been holding for days. She asked what he would do if the station no longer needed him. Ethan considered that while checking a pressure gauge, then said he would find another place that did, because usefulness was not about location but about willingness. Lyra listened, leaning against the doorframe, and felt the words settle in places she had kept guarded. She asked then, more carefully than she intended, what he would do if they chose to leave. Ethan did not answer immediately. He shut the panel, wiped his hands, and said he would miss them, but he would not try to keep them, because staying only mattered if it was chosen freely. That night, Lyra did not sleep. She sat outside beneath the stars, thinking of the world she had lost and the one she had never been allowed to imagine. She thought of ranks and orders, of how value had always been assigned from above, never discovered from within. When dawn came, she found Ethan already awake, sitting on the steps with a mug of coffee, watching the light creep across the ground. She sat beside him and told him the truth she had avoided. She told him she had once been responsible for others, that her exile had not been for failure, but for refusing to abandon those deemed expendable. The sentence had been meant to erase that choice, to teach her that compassion was disobedience. Ethan listened without interruption, without surprise. When she finished, he said quietly that Earth was full of people punished for caring too much, and that sometimes the punishment failed. Nelith joined them, bringing a folded data pad, her expression calm but resolute. She said she had received a message through unofficial channels, nothing binding, nothing threatening, but an acknowledgement that their exile conditions had been met, that further oversight was unnecessary. The implication was clear. They could remain on Earth without consequence. Lyra felt the weight of that settle on her shoulders, not as relief, but as responsibility. She realized then that freedom was heavier than exile, because it required direction. She turned to Ethan and asked him if he would allow them to stay, not as fugitives, not as helpers passing through, but as part of the place they had built together. Ethan looked at the station, at the machines humming steadily, at the quiet evidence of shared effort, and said the station did not belong to him alone, and that places became homes when people decided to care for them. As the day unfolded, they began making plans without ceremony, small adjustments, shared responsibilities, no declarations. Lyra found herself smiling at a faulty relay that needed replacing, at the simplicity of fixing something that stayed fixed. Nelith mapped future improvements, her notes no longer tentative. Ethan watched them both and felt something settle in his chest, not pride, not ownership, but gratitude. When night fell again, Lyra stood beneath the stars and understood the twist she had never expected. Exile had been meant to strip her of purpose. Instead, it had led her to a place where purpose was chosen, not assigned, and to a human who never once asked her to be anything other than what she already was. Morning came quietly, the kind that did not announce itself but revealed details one by one, light catching on the edge of the gravel, the station humming awake as if it had never slept. Ethan stepped outside with his mug and paused, listening to the air move through the vents, steady and even. Inside, Nelith was already at the console, adjusting a long-term schedule she had drafted overnight, her focus calm, assured. Lyra stood nearby, not guarding, not watching for threats, but simply present, hands resting on the railing as she watched the world wake up. The station no longer felt like borrowed shelter. It felt lived in. Over the following weeks, word spread in small, ordinary ways. A regional coordinator requested Ethan's input on efficiency standards. A neighboring facility asked for advice on stabilizing airflow during seasonal shifts. Ethan shared the credit without hesitation, listing Nelith's refinements and Lyra's oversight in plain language, never elevating, never diminishing. No one questioned it. On Earth, competence had a way of speaking for itself if given room. One afternoon, as they reviewed a message confirming expanded operational autonomy for the station, Lyra leaned back and laughed softly, not sharp or bitter, but surprised. She said exile had promised obscurity, not influence. Ethan smiled and said sometimes the smallest places taught the biggest lessons, because they forced people to pay attention to what actually worked. Nelith added that systems thrived when they were maintained by those who chose to be there, not those assigned by authority. Ethan nodded, thinking of all the times he had almost left this place behind. As seasons shifted, the station adapted, not because it had to, but because the people inside it cared enough to notice the changes. Lyra took on responsibility naturally, coordinating schedules, anticipating needs, offering protection not from fear, but from commitment. Nelith continued refining processes, mentoring visiting technicians with patience and clarity, her confidence no longer tentative. Ethan watched them both and understood something he had not known he was missing. He had never been alone, exactly, but he had never expected to be joined like this, by choice rather than necessity. One evening, as the sky deepened into blue and the first stars appeared, Lyra stood outside with Ethan, the quiet stretching comfortably between them. She said she had once believed dignity was granted by rank, reinforced by obedience. Now she understood it was something quieter, earned through how one treated others when no one demanded it. Ethan said humans took a long time to learn that lesson too, and many never did, but that did not mean it was not worth living by. Nalith joined them, looking up at the unfamiliar constellations, and said Earth was strange in many ways, but generous in one that mattered. It let people become more than what they were punished for. As night settled in, the station lights glowed softly against the dark, a small island of warmth and purpose. There was no ceremony, no declaration of endings or beginnings. Just three figures standing together, breathing the same air they had chosen to care for. In the silence that followed, the stars reflected faintly in Lyra's eyes, and for the first time since her exile, they did not look distant or cold. They looked possible.